In 1789, Thomas Jefferson said that, in quotes, no society can make a perpetual constitution. The earth belongs always to the living and not to the dead. Every constitution then and every law naturally expires at the end of 19 years. End quotes. In this context, there has been growing criticism in the US that our Constitution needs reform and potentially needs to be updated in its entirety. This is a complicated issue, but we are going to get into the pros and cons today on the Tonic Accord podcast. Hey, everybody, and thanks for joining us today on the Tonic Accord. I'm Alex Kapitko, joined by my friend, co-host, and colleague, Drew Nepley. What's up, my friend?
Hey, hello. I'm doing good. I'm ready to talk about the Constitution.
Yeah, so let's just get it going. So to start things off, whether you like the U.S. Constitution or not, the document itself is pretty fascinating. It is the oldest constitution in the world, and Norway's second, but there's like about 40 years, I believe, between the two, so it's quite impressive. And I think supporters of the U.S. Constitution would say that it was made vague in order for it to remain feasible through the evolution of time, culture, and space. And the Constitution does evolve, and that's kind of first what I did want to just get into to kind of start a basis for this conversation, because I think, right now especially, our country's very divided. And you kind of hear criticisms on both sides. I mean, the right has the Convention of States, which wants to definitely, put out a constitutional convention to go about amending the Constitution. And a lot of people on the left thinks that the Constitution's outdated. So what I did want to say first is that there are kind of two main ways to amend the Constitution. One is the amendment process. And I mean, the Constitution has changed because Congress has submitted 33 amendment proposals and 27 have been ratified. The 27th was the most recent, and it was ratified in 1992. And so just to highlight for our listeners who maybe need a refresher is that the following steps must be completed for the amendment process to be finalized, I guess. So step one would be passage by Congress. And this is proposed amendment language, which must be approved by 2/3 of both houses. Step two is the notification of the states, which the National Archivist sends notifications and materials to the governors of each state. Step three is ratification by 3/4 of the states. And then you go to step four, which is tracking state actions. And these proposed amendments must be ratified by 3/4 of the states in order to take effect. Then you have step five, which is the announcement, which I think is pretty self-explanatory. And so that is one step. That is the amendment process itself. And then the other one is an amendment by constitutional convention. And this has never happened. In addition to constitutional amendments, states have the option of petitioning Congress to call a constitutional convention. And legislatures in 2/3 of states must agree. So that's, especially tough right now. So all I'm saying right now is that our Constitution can be reformed, but it's extremely complicated. And before I turn this over to Drew here, what I also wanted to just say was that the Chicago School of Law, which is Chicago University, had a really good article talking about kind of how some constitutions last and how others don't. And they just say that enduring constitutions share three important qualities. First, durable constitutions tend to emerge under conditions characterized by an open, participatory process. Second, durable constitutions tend to cover a wide range of topics, inducing the parties to reveal information and to invest in the negotiation process. And I do later want to get back to that revealing part because it's crucial. And third, durable constitutions tend to be flexible ones, in which they provide reasonable mechanisms by which to amend and interpret the text to adjust the changing conditions. So that's kind of where I want to set this conversation, Drew. What do you think? How do you feel our Constitution is aged, and does it need to be changed or rewritten or reformed or what?
Well, it's I don't have like a I'm not going to say like the Constitution is bad or good, right? I think that in some ways the amendment process has allowed our Constitution some flexibility, right? We were able to, experiment with new things like, banning alcohol and then reversing that, and giving women the right to vote. There's a lot of things that needed to change over time, and our Constitution allowed for that to happen. Which is very good. in other ways, and I think my concerns with our Constitution are kind of the fundamental building blocks of some of our institutions have not aged as well. And so that's kind of where I lie. There are plenty of things in our Constitution that we should keep, but there are some things, and I'll get into the specifics, that I definitely think are outdated or have not turned out in the same way. And I think that similar to what Thomas Jefferson you mentioned in the beginning, the times change and things need to be looked at every 20 years or so to make sure that they're up to date. Mankind lives in the present and not in the past. We can certainly learn from the past, but the past can't predict the future. And so,
Right.
for example, we live in a digital age in a globalized world. Those two things, those words I even just said, didn't even exist at the time our Constitution was written. So to think that we have to adhere to something that's hundreds of years old in a world where things happen so quickly and so rapidly and so differently, it's ill-advised to maintain something like that. And again, like you said, 700 constitutions have been written and rewritten since World War II alone. The idea that, I've always heard this, that America is a young country. It is. It is a young country in the sense that of our own nation state style. But as, compared to someone that has an ethnic background of thousands of years in Germany. But our Constitution is actually relatively old, like you mentioned before. So I definitely think it needs to take some. I think it's okay to take a microscope to our Constitution. It doesn't mean you're un-American. It doesn't mean you're not a patriot. And you mentioned in the beginning that the left currently is the most willing to amend or change the Constitution, but there have been plenty of Republicans that have wanted to change or revise our Constitution or have a constitutional caucus. What was it? The word that you said?
Convention.
Convention.
Constitutional
Sorry,
convention.
excuse me.
Yeah.
So this is not a partisan issue, and I think the idea of partisan issues is one of the big problems with our Constitution. Is that we live in a world now that is so partisan that the founding fathers even warned us about. George Washington famously warned against factions and political parties would be the death of democracy, and I don't think our Constitution was ready for it.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that, and I agree with it in practicality, but not in theory. This is like you said too. This is something that's tough for me because I think it has its place as being a very effective constitution, but it also has issues, like you said, and I think we get criticism. I mean, I've definitely heard Europeans in my time over there talk about this, about how our constitution is relatively short, and my response to that has always been, and you can definitely correct me if you think it's wrong, but I've always felt that somehow we've kind of skipped the nitty gritty of specifics in more of a term for kind of basic building blocks that kind of want to build kind of more this American idealism, this American idea. And I definitely hear criticism for people who say that, well, but the founding fathers endorsed slavery. They said all men are created equally, but actually it was a very small amount of the population that could actually vote and had rights protected. And yes, definitely. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But also at the same time, I think you have to think that the Constitution did allow for reform from that. There were amendments that over time this did evolve. So I don't like the argument I hear from people where, well, the Constitution is just outdated. No, it's not. I mean, in some ways, yes. Like you said, in terminology and just adjusting for technology and advancements in just life and culture and society, yes. But I think that in some ways, all the criticisms do get figured out. But my issue is kind of also yours, which is that there are just some more of the actual specifics of how we've set up government has actually kind of allowed for some of these problems. And the Atlantic had a great article that was talking about how, everyone's talking about how the system is rigged. And, you had Trump talking about draining the swamp. And I mean, you've definitely had leftists as well talking about the same thing, about how the establishment, the system is rigged, the system is racist. And the Atlantic says the Constitution is the crisis, and there is some interesting things to that, where I think that we're starting to see some of the Achilles heels of the Constitution. Like, just to name a few, that the Senate, according to the Atlantic, violates any principle of the one person, one vote idea.
Right.
Just 9 states, meaning 18 Senate seats, are home to roughly 52% of the American population. So you have the remaining 41 states having a minority. And the Atlantic says that by 2040, it is estimated that 70% of the population will live in 15 states. And while the remaining 30% of Americans will have 70 senators. So like that's one of my things is that I think we kind of thought that population sizes would remain small, and we also kind of thought that the US would remain agrarian, and a lot of that hasn't maintained. And so what I kind of want to do, like if I was, say they're like, Alex, you need to sit in the room and help build a new constitution or reform this constitution, I would say I want to keep the ideals and kind of what it was prescribed as the American dream and this American exceptionalism, but I kind of want to evolve it to we're not an agrarian society with farmers anymore.
Well, certainly. I mean, I'm not on the side that says throw the whole thing out. There are
Good.
there are plenty of things that we need to keep, like the amendment process, right? A lot of the rights that are given to the citizens, not given, but ingrained in citizenship, right? Freedom of press, the right to bear arms. These are all things that I think should stay. The right to not have soldiers be forced upon your living quarters, right? Things that we may even take for granted, but there at one point that was a problem for Americans, and at other parts of the country, other parts of the world, that's an issue, right? The military has too much control, military juntas and such. So there are absolutely parts of our Constitution that are vital to what being an American is, and we should preserve that. I'm with you there, but again, I think that like you mentioned about the senator issue, that how you could have extremely small states have way more voting power because of the 2 senators. Even back in the time that this was being written, where even in the agrarian society of only 9 or 13 colonies and states, like the early states, it was still an issue of that, how much your vote matters, because large states like Pennsylvania and New York didn't want that senator system, and small states like Delaware did. And it was only because they had that senator system where you can have 2 senators no matter how big your state is, that some of these states were willing to sign on. So even back then that issue arose, and today I think it's only exacerbated. Republican or Democrat, you find this problem across the country. My Republican colleagues and friends in California often say my vote doesn't matter. I mean, on a presidential and on a larger scale level, of course, I always encourage people to get into local politics, but that's aside. On for the vote for the president, if you're in California and you're a Republican, it doesn't matter. Up until recently, if you were in Texas and a Democrat, the same thing would be true, right? Let's different example, like Alabama. If you're a Democrat in Alabama, your vote this election in 2020 for the president just doesn't matter. It doesn't, because of our system, because of the Constitution set up the system of the first past the post way of electoral. One, the electoral college, and then 2, the way it's the majority takes the whole pot. So that's where if we were to change our Constitution, what would be some of the changes? I think the first past the post problem, which is the idea that if you get 50.1% of the vote, you then represent 100% of that electorate. That needs to go to the wayside. That is the reason we only have 2 parties, because only in a system where you would have to have 2 parties to have big umbrellas and grab a ton of people so that you can get your party first past the post, instead of a parliamentary system where, like the state of California, if you had 40% Republicans, 60% Democrats, their representation would be as such in the electoral system, represented that way, the 1-to-1 ratio or something close to that, instead of what we have. Like parts of California will have Republican representation, but there's problems with gerrymandering and all sorts of things that really don't represent the true electoral public.
Yeah. I mean, well, I go really back and forth. First off, kind of on the parliamentary versus 2-party systems. And, kind of to go back to the Senate problem, which I think we both agree does definitely need reform, which I think going about that could be extremely difficult. But, and this kind of ties into the parliamentary part too, is that, I think, so it's Section 3 of Article 1 that talks about, each state allotting 2 senators. And I think it kind of sums up some of the downfalls of our Constitution, which are also some of our strengths as a nation, was the idea of compromise, right? Like the Constitution was not made out of kind of a single idea from a certain, bit of the population or a certain person that had a political agenda. The Constitution was kind of a give or take, and for good and bad. And I think one of the bad of that was the compromise that allowed 2 senators to be in every state. But that kind of goes to my further thing about the parliamentary system. And I don't almost think the U.S. in our current makeup would be able to sustain it. Maybe on state levels, I think I could agree with you that especially in states that does need to happen. And like you mentioned, in California, we see it in Maine, and I think it's being taken up more and more by states. But the U.S. is big, and I'm very especially torn on the Electoral College, for example, because I think it is a completely ridiculous aberration that if you win the popular vote, you should not also, for example, win the president's. But that being said, cities on the coast attract a bunch of people, right? Like that's just what cities do. They're a conglomeration of people. And I do understand the sentiment in the middle of the country where cities incentivize people to live there. And the people that choose to maybe take the other alternative and work, whatever that may be, from coal mining to agriculture to whatever it may be. And I'm not trying to, put an umbrella over all these people, but they don't want to feel like they don't have any say. And the Electoral College is flawed, but I think it still guarantees that even people that may feel like they're not the, conglomerated population that makes all the decisions, they still can have a voice. And that goes back to this compromise effect in the Constitution, where it was kind of a push and pull, a give and take. And I don't know if you could even amend parts of that without completely getting out kind of the central themes of our Constitution. And that kind of goes then back to the parliamentary thing, I guess, which is, in Spain, for example, which is obviously my best point of reference, but I think you see it throughout most of Europe, is that parliaments, yeah, you're right. They allow more voices to have a say, even if you're, like you said, a Democrat in Alabama. But then at the same time, you see just a very flawed process where you have an election almost every year, especially during times of turmoil, where you almost end up having a two-party system. Like in Spain, you have the center-right party and the far-right party, Vox, which is pretty similar to Trump in most policies. And on the left, you have kind of a Bernie Sanders, who is Iglesias, and then there's the centrist in the party. And because the center-left and the center-right can't agree on anything, the center-right ends up signing a pact with the far-right party. And they have about 30-40% of the population. And even though, yes, there's a bunch of parties, it basically becomes a coalition between the right and a coalition between the left. And you see these fractions inside of these coalitions, but they still make ideas as a base. So ironically, even though these parliaments are supposed to have, a plurality of ideas, because of how divisive humans are by nature and just values, you kind of end up getting just black versus white anyways. And so I don't know if that's the total solution in the U.S. is just allowing more plurality in elections, but I don't know what is either.
Well, look, I understand that, right? Yes, it's been observed that parliamentary systems, you have you still have factions, you still have umbrellas. They're there, but there is more width and breadth for them to change with the times than there is between just two parties. The coalitions often change. We talked about Ireland earlier this year and how some of the coalitions have changed in the last couple decades for that nation. Coalitions have, in a parliamentary system, there are coalitions, but the coalitions have more width and breadth to change. Whereas in our system, it's been Republican and Democrat, and for a long time, and the modern form of Republican versus Democrat, right, which is kind of Southern strategy, early 20th century, basically 100 years of the parties we have today, of the Democrats we know as the Democrats now, and the Republicans we know as the Republicans now, because in the past they had same names but kind of different ideologies. But The parties we're dealing with today kind of go back 100 years. And that's it. That's pretty much it. Green Party, are you kidding me? Libertarian Party, what a joke, right? So I understand that, yeah, parliamentary systems are not perfect. Of course. I don't think, I mean, if there was a perfect government system out there, we'd all be doing it, right? But there's not. But I certainly think that a lot of our problems are caused, like the problem that we have with the two-party system and how divisive it is. How divisive it is in America right now, where, you know, people identify more with their party than they do with just kind of an overall Americanism, is really dangerous. And it's because of the way our Constitution is set up in terms of elections. I don't think the Electoral College is a good thing. I understand the argument that middle America states or smaller states, they don't want to feel bullied by larger metropolitan coastal cities and states. On the reverse, though, why is it then fair for millions of people in cities to be bullied around by small middle America states? Like, I don't see how. I see that there's an inequity, but it also goes both ways, because the way it turns out right now is it's not that there's this discussion between agrarian states and city states. It's more like Ohio, Michigan, and Wisconsin, and a couple other states are the most important battleground states, and everyone else can just go screw themselves because we already know how they're going to vote. You know what I mean? Like, that doesn't sound like a democracy to me, especially, again, let's be real here. Hillary Clinton won the popular vote. If we didn't have the Electoral College, we'd have a completely different president currently in office. For many, that's scary, right? But until it flips the other way, right? If there's a Republican that won the popular vote, but the Democrat won the Electoral College, I guarantee you Republicans will be asking for the Electoral College to be abolished. I think it's an outdated system, and I think it was a system born of the idea of compromise. But in reality, it only promotes this idea that only a few battleground states matter, and the amount of money poured into Ohio is insane compared to the amount of political attention and money on other states. And so, in an effort to reduce inequity in our political system, I fear that it's only created more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I don't disagree with that, and I think there should be less weight put on these battleground states. I think that's something we can definitely agree on. What I would say though is you know, you kind of said letting these, I mean, either way, letting these big states or these small states bully the other is not democratic. And then you mentioned, you know, that in kind of our system, it's kind of more allegiance to party than country, which I agree with, which is a problem. But I don't think it's any better in these parliamentary countries. Okay. I don't. I mean, you saw Boris Johnson politicize the coronavirus in almost the exact same way Trump did. In France, you had, you know, these far right parties basically control, you know, protest anything that Macron did. You had in Spain Vox, the far right party, do protests against masks and quarantines every night, clanging pots outside their windows. So I would push back and say that there's still a lot of anti-democratic measures that go on in these countries, and that's the problem. Is I think it's more of a broad issue, is where humans are just outgrowing kind of this establishment that we created a long time ago. You know, we're still living in a system that was created by our ghosts, and I think, yeah, you can say, okay, we need to be parliamentary, or we need to get rid of the Electoral College, or we need to hold on to our two-party system, or, you know, whatever your spin or side may be on this. But I think the end of the day is that maybe there's just something going on in the world that means we're almost evolving out of what we're in right now. And like, I mean, the example I use is like, I kind of want to also, you know, kind of look back at, could a constitution be recreated? You know, could you actually do that? Could you rewrite a constitution and still kind of maintain how your country is? And NPR had an interesting study. This was back, I believe it was in 2014. And it was this man who went around the country asking students how they would change the terminology in the Constitution, and what things they would keep and what things they would not keep. And I think the talk did a good job of exposing how complicated it would be. He started with the preamble, and he asked the students if they would keep "we the people." And the conversations then got complicated when one kid would say, let's make we the people all citizens of the United States. But then another student was like, well, immigrants have rights too, so we should also say all people in the United States. But then another kid was like, well, some immigrants would not be paying taxes, so should they be able to vote? Then another kid was like, well, how about anyone who promotes the welfare of the nation can vote? But then another kid responded, well, you're too young to vote. You're only 14. So I can't help but wonder if the fact that our Constitution was short and built on compromises could have been somewhat of a strength because, okay, we the people, obviously when it was written, a lot of people were not free, right?
Of course.
But since that time, it has evolved, and that terms has changed in meaning while remaining the same term. And so like I just want to kind of keep on that point of where I have talked to people on the right and the left who think that maybe it is time to do something about this Constitution, but I worry that in the kind of political landscape we're in right now, it would just open the floodgates for kind of just one-sided policy.
Sure. I mean, Roe v. Wade, right, would be a massive point of contention if you tried to, do something with that. I mean, we may not agree on the whole parliamentary restructuring, but I do agree that I think it was intentional that it was short, and I think the idea was that the judiciary would be the area where they kind of hash out the unique aspects of the law in regards to the Constitution, and that's what we've seen. The problem is one. The appointment for life leads to this race to then stack the court in your favor with judicial activism, right? The idea that everyone knows, like, oh, that's a leftist judge, that's a right-wing judge. You know what I mean? Oh, we can almost predict how things are going to get voted, except save a few in the middle, right? This kind of swing voters, but it's like, you have. You have 9 people deciding incredibly powerful laws for hundreds of millions. So, in one aspect, the shortness of the Constitution and the judiciary's ability to interpret that is a strength because it is mendable and bendable, and we've adapted. And again, we have amended our Constitution, 20-something times. So there is that positive. But on the negative aspect is, I think we need to make some small changes, right? I don't think they should be appointed for life. I don't think Ruth Bader Ginsburg should be battling cancer in her late 80s, while she's a judge. I don't think presidents should try and stack courts before they're out of office so that they can have a legacy that lasts decades long. No matter what party we're talking about, I don't think that's good for our system. And so I do think there's a couple of tweaks that need to be made. But overall, I can agree with you that I think our Constitution, it has proven itself to be mendable and bendable. But I think that today, with the current political state, much like you said, that amendment process is almost completely thrown out the window if our two parties are so at odds with each other and so divided that there's no way we're ever going to get 2/3 of our electorate to agree on something. That's what worries me. That's what worries me is that the gates that the founding fathers opened for our Constitution to change are now no longer open just because of the political nature of the political climate.
Yes. I could not imagine us. Well, I mean, it's never happened, but I definitely now could not imagine us having a constitutional convention. I don't even know how the hell that would even be possible at this point. And yeah, I mean, the last amendment was in 91, 92, which was the 27th. And I mean,
it was a small one compared. I mean, the big one was in the 70s.
Right. I think 27th was involving not taking pay raises as a public employee or something along those lines. So it wasn't. Yeah, like you said, it wasn't anything too big. Yeah. So it's tough. It's really tough to me. And, I want to turn it back to the relevance of the moment, just kind of for time's sake, kind of to like slowly start wrapping this up. But I just talked to so many people, even close friends, who tell me, I think it's time to scrap the Constitution and rewrite it. And I just don't think it would work. I know that we have more words now, and we understand, race and identity and sexuality better, and we understand equality better. But it's almost the fact that we understand every aspect of human life that I think that both sides would try to fine tune that in their better interest. And, in the intro, I talked about how, I listed those three things that make a constitution endure. And I talked about how, I think it was the second one. Yeah. I said that parties have to be transparent and to reveal information and to invest in the negotiation process. And that same Chicago University School of Law article also talked about how a lot of constitutions fail. A lot of constitutions fail. And usually they fail during times of division, partisanship, or civil war. And it makes sense because both sides have a completely different view of what needs to be put into the Constitution. And so they're hiding incentives. They're, the devil's in the details. And so there's a lot of side work that is left out of the, face-to-face conversation. And so for a constitution to live on and endure, it needs to be transparent. And I think both sides were willing to be transparent because there really wasn't both sides when the Constitution was made. It was kind of like we need to protect our citizens and create a nation after leaving the, Great Britain at the time. And now it almost feels like there'd be ulterior motives, if like between the left and the right in this country, because I think the right would probably try to find ways to get out of Roe v. Wade, and the left and the left would try to add in some grandfather clauses involving probably public goods and secularism, and I think we would just never have a conversation that works. And so it opens the floodgates to extremism, I think, and it's why amendments are the best thing we have. But I think until we come back to a kind of calm playing field, we're not going to have those. And I wonder, is our Constitution just kind of set now or what?
Yeah, I mean, real quick before we get out of here, I mean, just on that issue of the parties that in play do have to be transparent with one another. Let's look at a recent quote unquote constitutional crisis, the impeachment of Donald Trump. Regardless of what party you may subscribe to, would you describe the other party as transparent during that debacle? I don't think anyone, Democrat or Republican, would argue that the other side was transparent. That is very worrisome if we're going to have a constitution that is still, viable. So I don't know. That's kind of my last point I wanted to throw out there.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that goes back into it, is that if you're hiding information, that was 2 out of 3 of the things that make a constitution endure. And if the other side isn't being transparent, and if the other side is basically finding devils in the details, I don't think that's going to create a lasting constitution that could live for decades or maybe even centuries. So,
or the ability, or the ability to amend it when we need. Right,
and I think again, like where we're at right now is a culmination of a long period of time. And, to be honest, I do think probably the best, I'm not saying the most feasible, but the best solution to this would be a convention of states. Because I think there are things that average Americans on both sides could agree on. We had Grayson on back in the day, and he worked for Convention of States, and he always told me that one of their biggest issues was just term limits. And I think that's something that the right and the left could agree on. And so,
absolutely,
it's the slow process. This Constitution's ever evolving. And so if we could maybe have a constitutional convention and just have 1 or 2 issues that we could agree on, that's ever evolving. You know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure. Well, one can hope.
Yeah, one can definitely hope. But for now, I can just hope that we get through 2020, and you guys can get through 2020 by listening to us and letting us know what you think and recommending people to bring on and telling your friends, telling everyone, even if you hate us, please share the word. You can hate us with your other friends, I guess. So anyways, check us out on YouTube, Podbean, Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Instagram, Facebook. I guess we have a website, tonicaccord.com. So check it out, and thanks for listening. Have a good week.
Take care.